Click here to subscribe our channel. Do not forget to press the bell icon to get regular updates of free videos.
Solow model. Look, before explaining this model, remember the purpose of any model is to explain economic growth, and growth means growth in GDP. So if you say that the Indian economy is growing at a rate of 5.2%, then it is growth in the GDP of Indian economy. So what determines that growth? We are going to explain that part. So in order to measure growth, there are two indicators. One is the growth in GDP and other is the growth in GDP per capita. One is the growth in total production and other is the growth in GDP per capita, per person income. So suppose if GDP doubles and population also doubles, then there is no growth in GDP per capita. The standard of living depends upon GDP per capita. It does not depend upon GDP per se. The standard of living depends upon income per person, GDP per capita. So there are two indicators of growth. One indicator is GDP, other indicator is GDP per capita, and GDP per capita is a better indicator as compared to GDP. Clear? So when we explain growth, then there are two growth indicators. A, GDP, and I present here GDP by Y, and that GDP is said to be a function of labor and capital. It's said to be a function of labor and capital as well as technology. So at a given state of technology, GDP is a function of labor and capital. So this, remember, this is basically a production function. You can express production function in any specific form, like if I write it ahead as Y labor to the power alpha, capital to the power 1 minus alpha. So it means GDP depends upon three numbers here. This A represents technology, L is a labor force, and K is capital. So GDP is basically a function of three things: technology, labor force, and capital. So growth in technology, growth in labor force, and growth in capital will determine finally the growth of GDP, because GDP depend upon these three. So growth in capital, growth in labor, and growth in technology will determine finally the growth of GDP. So this is the first part that we will be explaining. So first indicator is GDP, but the better indicator is GDP per capita. GDP per capita, and for per capita you divide GDP with population, and labor force is here representing population. Clear? So we are assuming that Y by L, and that Y by L will be simply denoted by small y. So whenever I write a small y, you have to read it as GDP per person, GDP per capita. That means if you divide the production function with labor, then you get production function in terms of GDP per capita. So I repeat my point. Growth indicator are two. One is GDP and the other is GDP per capita, and GDP per capita is a better indicator. So any growth model which will be explaining how GDP per capita is growing, how that GDP per capita is increasing, that will be considered as a explanation for the growth process. So growth depends upon technology, it depends upon labor force, and it depends upon technology. So when we will be building Solow model, we will build Solow model in step wise. Like in the first model, we consider technology constant, we consider labor force constant. So if technology is also constant, labor is also constant, then the GDP can increase Only because of increase in capital. Only because of increase in capital. So, and when capital increases, and capital means what? Capital means a stock of plant and machinery. So, at any given point of time, suppose on 1st of April 2021, the stock of capital in the economy is 400, and on the 31st March 2022, the stock of capital increases to 700. So, during this period, more capital has been accumulated, more plant and machinery has been established. So, the stock of plant and machinery has increased. Because the stock of plant and machinery has increased, which means economy can produce more of output now, because those plant and machinery helps to produce output. So, if you accumulate more machinery, you are able to produce more of output. So, if technology is constant and labor is constant, then growth depends upon capital accumulation. So, we will start with capital accumulation first. After that, we will make labor force also variable. That means growth they will be guided by capital accumulation as well as by labor. And in the final part, we will make technology also as variable. So, there are 3 steps. In the first step, technology and labor is fixed, only capital is variable. In the second, technology is fixed, labor and capital both are variable. In the third, all 3 are variable. Clear? So, there are 2 indicators, GDP and GDP per capita. So, I think the point is clear. GDP is determined by 3 factors according to this model. I am not saying that it is complete. We are discussing a model as provided by Solow. So, as provided by Solow, Solow was basically a neoclassical. So, since it was neoclassical, इसलिए हमने क्लासिकल की तरह फंक्शन लिखा है. Y is a function of labor and capital. अगर Keynesian होता तो Y was equal to AD लिखते, but Solow was basically part of neoclassical. So, it is a neoclassical theory that we are going to explain. So, if you have to simply up to this, if you have to give the idea of Solow model, then Solow model we can say that it will be designed, or it has been designed to explain how technology, labor force and capital interact, and how their interaction is determining output, and how their interaction is determining the growth of output. So, it is designed to explain that part. So, we are going to elaborate that part now. Clear? So, this was just the idea that Solow model is trying to explain. Solow model is designed to explain how technology, labor force and capital interact, and how that interaction is determining the growth part. Clear? So, we can start with this per capita etc. we can convert like y is equal to a labor to the power alpha capital to the power 1 minus alpha. If you divide it throughout by labor, then it will become GDP per capita as a function of labor per capita. Clear? Or capital per capita. So, you can start with the main idea and then we can elaborate the model. I written the main idea. That means any question, if any question is on Solow model, you can start with that main idea. So, write that paragraph first. Solow model is designed to show how growth in capital stock, comma growth in labor force and advances in technology interact in an economy and how they affect total output of goods and service of an economy. How they affect total output of goods and services of an economy. This is the main idea. Next sentence. It is based on law of diminishing return. It is based on law of diminishing return. Underline that. It is based on law of diminishing return to individual factor of production. To individual factor of production. So stop. It means as stock of capital increases, as stock of capital increases, marginal product of capital will decrease. 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 So it is based upon law of diminishing return. So I will be explaining that model. So we can start with the basic part. Remember, what you have written so far is the main idea, that it is designed to explain how technology, capital and labor interact and how their interaction is determining the output. So in that model, y is a function of capital and labor, and it is expressed as a capital to the power alpha, labor to the power 1 minus alpha. Clear? This is in fact the technically it is a Cobb-Douglas production function. So if this word is used, don't get confused. This Cobb-Douglas production function. So technology, capital and labor, and then we will be discussing, now we are discussing this basics model. So I repeat my point. In this first part we will be keeping technology constant, we will be keeping labor constant. So we are focusing mainly on capital, and there are two indicators, one is the GDP, other is the GDP per capita. So write down the basic model now. We can build Solow model. We can build Solow model in a series of steps. We can build Solow model in a series of steps. In a series of steps. So in the first step, let us assume that labor force and technology are constant. Labor force, that is L, and technology, which is represented here by A. Labor force and technology are constant. So output can change only due to change in stock of capital. Only due to change in stock of capital. Only due to change in stock of capital. Clear? Next paragraph. Solow model is based on assumption of constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale. Underline that. Which means when both labor and capital will be increased, in a given proportion, and both capital and labor will be increased in a given proportion, then output will also increase in the same proportion. Output will also increase in the same proportion. Output will also increase in the same proportion. So it is based upon constant returns to scale, which means if you change all inputs in a given proportion, output will also change in the same proportion. So if y is a function of capital and labor, and you are expressing it as a capital to the power alpha, labor to the power 1 minus alpha. So if capital and labor both are changed by t times, then output will also increase by t times, which means now in place of this k, you can write t k to the power alpha, t l to the power 1 minus alpha. So t you can take it, and then t to the power alpha and t to the power 1 minus alpha, which means only t. A capital to the power alpha, labor to the power 1 minus alpha, and this is your earlier production, which means when you increase capital and labor by t times, production will also increase by t times. Production will also change by the same proportion. So that is the meaning of constant returns to scale. And don't get confused that earlier I have said it is based upon diminishing return. It is based upon diminishing return to capital, diminishing return to one factor. And when I say returns to scale, that means you change both the factor. So when both factor will be doubled, output will double. But when only capital will be double, output will not double. When both factor will double, output will be doubled according to the constant returns to scale. But when only capital will be double, output will increase, but it will not double. That is based upon diminishing return. So this type of technical note you can write it in rough, not necessary to use in as a part of your answer. So y is a function of capital and labor. So if you increase capital by t times, labor also by t times, then output will also increase by t times. Clear? This y will also increase by t times. Now if I consider t as 1 by L, just consider this number as 1 by L. So if this is 1 by L, then what you will write here? It will become y by L, a function of k by L, and here if you write 1 by L, then it will be only one constant number. And what is this y by L? Y by L is a GDP per capita denoted by small y, and k by L is capital per capita and denoted by small k, and ignore that constant number 1. So what we have done, this is the aggregate production function, and we have converted it into production function in terms of per capita. So I will be using production function in terms of per capita, because per capita is a better indicator of growth. So the focus is on to explain growth, but how to measure that growth? We will be measuring that growth in terms of the per capita. So this was aggregate production function, these are the absolute, this is GDP, and this y is GDP per person or per capita. So it means that if you plot y as a function of k, that means if k will increase, y will also increase, but it will increase at diminishing rate. So slope will be declining. It's not negative, but it will be, slope is declining. So this y is a function of k. Clear? Like for example, suppose if I say that y is equal to under root k, that means if capital is 100, then output will be 10. But if capital is 200, then output won't be 20. It will be less than 20. So y as a function of k. Clear? So at any given point of time, so you can use it as your first diagram, and this is the diagram for production function, and this is production function expressed in terms of per capita, not absolute, but you are writing here as per capita. So y as a function of k, because in the first step the focus is on capital accumulation, not on the labor force, not on the technology. Continue this. In the basic Solow model, GDP per capita GDP per capita, within bracket you can write a small y. GDP per capita is a function of capital per capita, is a function of capital per capita, is a function of capital per capita. Full stop. Due to diminishing return, due to diminishing return to capital, due to diminishing return to capital, after comma, marginal product of capital is declining. 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 In bracket just mention that technically it means that slope of production function, slope of production function, slope of production function, that is margin product, slope of production function is declining. Slope of production function is declining. Remember, this is not a straight line, so slope at any particular point you can calculate by drawing a tangency. So slope of this straight line will be equal to slope of this curve at that point. But if you draw tangency here, then it will be a flatter line. That means slope is declining. So slope of production function is marginal product. Just remember that. Slope of production function is marginal product. So this is a production function. This represents one side of the model. That means by drawing this, if I ask how much is the GDP per capita, suppose you know that relationship, y as a function of k. You have written y here and you have written k here. If you know that relationship, and if I ask how much is the GDP per capita, then you in counter you will say how much is the capital per capita, because y is a function of k. So if you know that k, then only you can answer y. Y is a function of k, but how much is that value of k? That value of k could be this number k1, it could be a different value. So what determines this k, we have to explain that part. So if the value of k is k1, then we can say that the output will be y1. But if the value of k is k2, then value of y will be, let us say, y2. So y depends upon k. Y is GDP per capita and it depends upon capital per capita. So now the focus is on what determines this k, whether its number will be k1 or k2 or k3. So this is one side of the model. Now come to the second side. This is from supply side. Now what is from the demand side? So in that basic model, we have to explain the demand side now in the next paragraph. In the basic Solow model, demand for goods comes from consumption and investment. Demand for goods comes from consumption and investment. Consumption and investment. It means output per worker is divided between consumption per worker and investment per worker. Output per worker is divided between consumption per worker and investment per worker. So you can now relate it from the macro section that y is also equal to AD, and aggregate demand has various components like consumption and investment. So if you restrict by ignoring government, by ignoring external sector, then we can say that y is equal to C plus I. Now this is aggregate, and we have converted the supply side, that is production function, in terms of per worker, per capita. So this will also be divided in expressed as per worker or per capita. So Y by L equal to C by L, I by L. So Y by L is output per capita, so small y. So C by L, consumption per capita, small c. I by L, investment per capita. So small y is equal to small c plus small I. Clear? So this was aggregate and this is in terms of per person or per capita. Continue with this. The model assumes that a constant fraction of income is saved. A constant fraction of income is saved and remaining is spent on consumption. A constant fraction of income is saved and remaining is spent on consumption. This actually means if the income is y, one part of that income has been saved, remaining part of the income has been spent on consumption. But how much is saving? Saving is part of income. So this fraction is, let us say, small s. So remaining will be 1 minus s. Clear? Like for example, if I say 20% of income is saved, that means the small s is 0.2. So you multiply that 0.2 with the income, that will be the saving. So saving is 0.2 into income. So what will be consumption? 1 minus s into y. Clear this point? Out of that income, one fraction has been saved, remaining has been spent on consumption. So small s is not saving, small s is saving rate. Saving is small s into y. Consumption is 1 minus s into y. So now substitute this consumption here. So y equal to, in place of c, what you will write? 1 minus s y plus I. If you expand it, this is y minus a small s y plus I. So this y will cancel out. So small s y is equal to y. And what is small s y? Small s y is nothing but saving per worker. Remember, small s is saving rate, small s y is saving per person. So this is saving per person equal to investment per person. So saving equal to investment. It is just a statement of that. Saving is equal to saving is equal to investment. So if you draw that curve, remember this was the curve for income. So if I multiply that income with saving rate, it will be translated downward, small s y. So the above one is production function, the lower one is saving function. So this is the saving function. So at any stock of capital, if you know the stock of capital at any point of time, then from production function we can determine how much is the output. From the saving function we can determine how much is the saving. So what is this gap? In fact, income minus saving. Income minus saving will be consumption. So this gap is nothing but consumption. Clear? So this gap is nothing but consumption part. So these are the two elements for Solow model. One element is production function and the other element is basically this aggregate demand part or saving function. Clear? So you can say in paper आपको ये सब लिखने की जरूरत नहीं पड़ेगी. These are things to understand. Now in examination what will be expected that you explain the main idea and then straight away now answer the steady state part. So now come to the question part, and question part is basically growth in the capital stock. So here onwards you can say relevant or important part. growth in capital stock. Oblique steady state level of capital. Steady state level of capital. Growth in capital stock or steady state level of capital. Clear? So if I write a stock of capital, remember I am writing here small k, that is capital per person. Small k is capital K upon L. So if this is the stock of at any given point of time, suppose in 2021, I am writing that stock of capital in 2021, then this is stock of capital of 2021, labor force of 2021. I am interested in knowing what will be the stock of capital in 22. What will be stock of capital in 22? So what determine that change in the stock of capital? Just focus here. What determine the change in the capital stock? I repeat, in the basic model we have considered technology constant and labor constant. So if labor is constant, so labor is constant means the labor of 2021 will be equal to labor of 22. So there is no change in labor. So if there is no change in labor, then there can be change only in the capital, and that change in capital is determined by two things. One, economy may procure or buy more machinery, then the stock of capital will increase. Or if there is no procurement of new machinery, then the old machinery will get depreciated during the production process. So due to depreciation the stock will decrease, and due to accumulation of more capital stock will increase. So there are two things. One, this stock will decrease because of depreciation, and this will increase because of capital accumulation. And capital accumulation is nothing but investment, and investment is equal to savings, and saving was small s into y. And how much is depreciated? Certainly entire stock will not get depreciated in 1 year. Suppose I say depreciation rate is 20%. So whatever be the stock of capital, 20% of it will get depreciated. So the depreciation amount will be depreciation rate into stock of capital. So if the stock of capital, let us say 400, in 21 what will be the stock? That will depend upon how much has been depreciated and how much is the procurement of new machine, that is investment. So the change in capital stock, delta K, change in capital stock will be investment minus depreciation. Clear? Investment minus depreciation. So by investment you increase the stock, and through depreciation the stock get reduced. And investment is equal to saving, and saving is a function of income. So you write small s y, and in place of depreciation you write depreciation rate into K. Clear? Now this y has also always been expressed, this y is a function of K. So in place of this y you can also write function of K. So depreciation is reducing it, investment is increasing it. So if investment is more, depreciation is less, then stock will increase, that is stock in 22 will be more as compared to stock of 21. And if a stock of capital is more, then output will also be more, because y is a function of K. So when K will rise, y will also rise. If depreciation is more, investment is less, then stock will reduce. But if they are equal, then if depreciation is equal to investment, then stock is neither increasing nor it is declining, and that stock is called steady state. So steady state is nothing but equilibrium. Equilibrium pe there will be no change. So steady state is that state where stock of capital is neither increasing nor it is declining, which means change is equal to 0. I repeat, Steady state is that state where stock of capital is neither increasing nor it is declining. So steady state is long run equilibrium of economy towards which economy always tends to move. So delta K is equal to, that means change in the capital stock is determined by this. But if I say at steady state, and remember at steady state delta K will be equal to 0, which means small s function of K minus delta K equal to 0. And if you are able to find the steady state, then steady state is a unique number. Like when you draw a curve, then there are many numbers for this K, but there is one number for steady state value. So that is for a steady state, you just put a star mark here. And this function depends upon the production function. So remember, you don't have to explain in terms of this equation. You are basically explaining in terms of words. So just to understand, remember the change in the capital stock is determined by two factors. Remember, we are still discussing the basic one. We have kept labor constant, we have kept technology constant. So once labor and technology will also change, the concept will get modified. But in this first class of Solow model, we are not making technology and labor force variable. We are keeping technology and labor force as constant. So change is only guided or determined by change in the capital stock. Clear? So explain this part. Then you can explain this graphically as well. You can calculate it numerically also if a function is given. I will give an example. First understand this. This is a K on vertical axis. Now you can write depreciation and investment. Investment is saving. So this is investment line. Investment is saving. So small s y, or you can say it is small s function of K, is one and same thing. Depreciation is a constant fraction of the stock of capital. So if I say depreciation rate is 20%, तो अगर stock of capital 800 होगा तो 20% of that, 1000 है then 20% of that, 1500 है then 20% of that. So this is a delta into K. Clear? Steady state is that number where depreciation is equal to investment. So equality comes at the point of intersection. So this is the steady state. And what is the significance of steady state? Suppose if I say that economy is at a steady state, what is the meaning of that? If economy is at steady state, so if economy is at a steady state, it means the stock of capital for 21 and stock of capital for 22, stock of capital for 23, in every year the stock will remain same. Economy is at a steady state. But if K is constant, then Y, that is GDP per capita, which is a function of K, will also remain constant. GDP per capita will also remain constant. So if you plot these things in terms of graph by plotting here time, that is year. So in 2021, in 2022, in 2023, the stock of capital and output will remain constant. So economy is at a steady state. But if the GDP per capita is steady, it means there is no growth. So at a steady state there is no growth. At a steady state there is no growth. The first concept is this. Steady state पे कोई growth नहीं है. But steady state पे कोई growth नहीं है. But when we say that, remember we have made an assumption. An assumption is that labor force is held constant, technology is held constant. So once those things will be made variable, the concept will get modified. So unless technology and labor force is not variable, there is no growth at steady state. No growth at steady state. steady state पे कोई growth नहीं है. Now the significance of steady state is that if economy is not a steady state, then what will happen? Suppose stock of capital is less, K1. Then if stock is K1, then you can say that at that stock depreciation is less, but investment is more. That means decrease is less, increase is more. Depreciation is less, investment is more. So stock is reducing less due to depreciation, but it is increasing more because of investment. So the stock of capital will increase. So next period stock of capital will be higher, further higher, and so on. So it is moving towards steady state. If stock of capital is more than steady state, then what will be the outcome? At that stock, investment will be less, depreciation is more, so decrease is more, increase is less. So the stock of capital will continue to decline. So it is declining and moving towards steady state. Clear? So a steady state is basically nothing but a long run equilibrium towards which economy tends to move. Whether you start with less capital or more capital, over a period of time economy will always tend to move towards a steady state. So in that way this K star is referred as long run equilibrium of economy. So this is your first idea or first concept in the Solow model, steady state explanation. But since I said you have to build this model in series of steps, so we will be modifying by adding labor as a variable, then technology as a variable, then how this concept will change. Clear? So explain up to this. At any given point of time, capital stock is an important factor. Capital stock is an important factor that determine output of an economy. Also, but capital stock can change over time. So at any given point of time we have a given stock of capital, but that stock of capital can change over time, and those changes can lead to economic growth. So it means economic growth is an outcome of accumulating more capital. Underline that sentence. It means economic growth is an outcome of accumulating more capital. Next paragraph. In particular, two forces influence capital stock. So one force is obviously depreciation and the other is investment. Two forces influence capital stock, that is investment and depreciation. So investment refers to, briefly define this term, investment refers to expenditure on new plant and machinery. So once your economy accumulate more plant and machinery, we say that investment is taking place, but we accumulate more plant and machinery to produce more of output. Expenditure on new plant and machinery, and it causes capital stock to rise. So on the other hand, depreciation refers to wearing out of, normal wear and tear is called depreciation, as we use machinery in the production process, there will be some normal wear and tear, and that loss in value due to normal wear and tear is called depreciation. Depreciation refers to wearing out of old capital, wearing out of old capital, and it causes value of capital stock to fall, and it causes value of capital stock to fall. Next paragraph. At a steady state, there is no change in capital stock. At a steady state, there is no change in capital stock because investment is exactly equal to depreciation. Investment is exactly equal to depreciation. Full stop. Next paragraph. The significance of steady state is that it represents long run equilibrium of economy. It represents long run equilibrium of economy. Underline that. Long run equilibrium of economy. It shows that regardless of the level of capital, with which economy begins, regardless of the level of capital with which economy begins, that means whether it begins with K1 or whether it begins with K2, it will end up at K star. Regardless of the level of capital with which economy begins, after comma, it always ends up at a steady state level of capital. It always ends up at steady state level of capital. Just to elaborate, for example, if stock of capital is less than a steady state, is this K1. If stock of capital is less than a steady state, then investment is more than depreciation. Investment is more than depreciation. So stock of capital will increase. Stock of capital will increase. Stock of capital will increase, and it will move towards a steady state. It will move towards a steady state. It will move towards a steady state. Next paragraph. We must also note that at a steady state, there is no growth. Underline that. At a steady state, there is no growth. There is no growth in output or output per capita. There is no growth in output or output per capita. So long as we assume that population and technology remains constant. We assume that population and technology remains constant. Population and technology remains constant. So remember, if I say that y, small y is constant, that small y is capital Y upon L, and if L is constant, then this y must also be constant because that ratio is constant. So there is no growth in GDP, there is no growth in GDP per capita at steady state. Clear? Now, so if economy is a steady state, that means the growth path is this flat. There is no growth when economy is at steady state. So when there will be growth?